us. I'm going to leave quite long pauses in between, so please just put your questions in, and if I don't get to them as Jamie is talking, we will be give some space for some questions at the end. Is that okay, Jamie?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So here we are. I'm going to hand over to Jamie, and off we go. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, welcome everybody. I can't see how many people are there, but welcome and thank you for coming along. The reason why I wanted to investigate this information to begin with and to share the information was really because I want the science to back up what we do in these spiritualist centers. So, you know, you get skeptical people that come into the centers and churches, and even if the medium is really good, they'll still leave with a sense of doubt. But if they were aware of the phenomenal evidence that's out there, then I don't think they would leave in any doubt. And also, it might encourage people to come in. And it's also a matter of helping people, because if people understand this information, then grief is easier to manage. I went to the National Hypnotherapy Convention it was actually nearly 2 years ago now. It was cancelled last year. And I was quite upset, if you like, by a bereavement counsellor who said that the current thinking is to talk about a continued connection, but she actually only meant it in a very abstract way. Then she said there are people who experience the presence of their loved one, whether they see them, whether they hear them, communicate in some way. And then she said, well, these are just hallucinations. But no, they're not. I've experienced one. I know it's not an hallucination. So onto the talk more generally. So let's look at, you probably already read this, but Nikola Tesla says the day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in 1 decade than all the previous centuries of its existence. Now, it's useful to know that, or interesting to note that Nikola Tesla and Einstein both had very similar methods. So Einstein would have a metal tray and a metal spoon. He would fall asleep during the day several times if he could, holding this metal spoon above the metal tray, so that when he fell asleep, the metal spoon would fall and hit the tray. And in that moment, he got closer to his higher consciousness. And as you'll see in a moment, it's all about the filter theory. So let's take a look at the nature of consciousness as it's understood at the moment. So the current Western scientific viewpoint is one of materialism. So everything can be explained if you look closely enough. It's a reductionist method. So basically, our consciousness, our awareness of being ourselves, and everything we experience are merely biochemical processes in the brain. Now, essentially, that means we're biological robots. Now, even the scientists are not terribly happy with this, because essentially it means we have no free will, and that everything is predetermined, and clearly it isn't. But nonetheless, that is the current view that's been sort of assumed in all medical training, and is the current scientific viewpoint. Dualism is the idea that we are, our mind and bodies are separate, our souls, if you like, and our bodies are separate. But also that's curious because it does imply an element of separateness. Now, panpsychism, universal mind, they're similar, not exactly the same, is the idea that consciousness is a fundamental ingredient in absolutely everything. It's in everything. So we are possibly connected on a core level. What started this off was, going the wrong way, was quantum physics. Very quick explanation. They wanted to find out whether light was a wave or a particle. So they shone individual photons through a double slit. Now, if light was a particle, you'd get 2 slits on the screen behind it. If it was a wave, you get an interference pattern. What they found was that while they were looking at it, it behaved like a particle, and while they turned their backs, it behaved like a wave. And this led Max Planck, basically the father of quantum physics, through his research and work, to regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Essentially, that's panpsychism. So let's look at the filter theory. This is an idea described by Hippocrates 2,000 years ago, and then by William James and Frederick Myers in the early 1900s, but more recently has been taken up by many scientists, and in particular Kelly and various colleagues, and they've written a book, Irreducible Mind Towards a Psychology for the 21st Century. So the idea is that the brain is a filter, a reducing valve. So if the brain is a reducing valve, if we can prove somehow that materialism is wrong, whether it's dualist or panpsychism, it means we are spiritual beings. So all these things on the screen there at the moment represent elements which show that the brain is a filter in some way, separate from our physical brain. So deathbed vision. So these are things that are actually really comforting. I'll talk about them more later. But where people are on their deathbed and they see a loved one come to collect them, their consciousness, their awareness expands. So I say I'll talk about more of those later. Terminal lucidity. This is interesting, quite rare, but cases where there's been brain damage, meningitis, perhaps dementia, or perhaps they've even been in a coma, but they'll suddenly, just before death, become totally lucid. Now, if you look at the physiology of the brain as it's dying, it's inexplicable. The brain is dying. It's not getting better. So, but if the brain is a filter, then essentially its filtering activity suddenly ceases, and you get a moment of terminal lucidity where people have got all their memories, they're totally lucid, and they can have a good conversation with their loved ones just before they pass. Deathbed coincidences. Well, these are cases where somebody miles away will suddenly have a dream or wake up to the fact that somebody has passed. There are thousands of them. Acquired savant syndrome. That's fascinating because I don't know whether you know about savants. They're Rain Man, Kim Peek was one of them. But acquired savant syndrome is where somebody will get almost superhuman mental powers for no explanation. Suddenly they might be able to play the piano. And if anybody is, well, I'm sure many of you will have learned to play the piano. It takes years. You can't just do that overnight. You can't just rewire the brain overnight to play the piano. Personal ADCs, these are after death communications. Well, some people will sense their loved one. My brother-in-law saw my late wife. I'll tell you about my experience later, but there are plenty of them. Past life memories. I can talk about that more later, where children will spontaneously remember in detail the life of a previous personality. Hypnotherapists use past life regression, and it works. If it didn't work, why would it happen? The very first time I regressed somebody as a hypnotherapist, I wasn't expecting to go into a past life. Now, this lady is a lovely lady. I've got full permission to tell you about this. She had a phobia of snakes, a severe phobia. She couldn't say the word snake. She'd shake at the very idea of a snake. And when she was 6, she used to get her younger sister to look under the bed for snakes. Well, I tried the usual desensitization methods. That didn't work. So I thought, well, I've got to regress her to see what happened. And I was expecting to find something when she was, I don't know, 3 or something. So I just took her onto a timeline and said, we'll just go back to when this happened. And she described being a little black boy being asked to get water for a kitchen in a bucket. And there were snakes and rocks. And I said curiously, what year is this? And she said 1894. And she also described another life where she was actually bitten by a snake. And the point is I did nothing clever, nothing complicated, merely awakening those memories just removed the phobia. Now, if they weren't real, then where did they come from? Why did it work? Anyway, so that's that. So then there's near-death experiences, and I'm going to talk about those later. They are wonderful. Put in psi here, that's a scientific word for things, all psychic phenomena like telepathy. They wanted to find a different word other than ESP, which was not popular with scientists at the time. Historical literature. Well, there's been knowledge come out throughout history, and where's it come from? It's knowledge that's been greater than the scientific ability to find it. Eastern philosophy. Democritus, that's I think 400 BC, described the nature of atoms. Where does information come from? Serendipitous coincidences. How many of you, I'm sure you've all been in a situation where you were stuck, you didn't know where the solution was coming from, and out of the blue a solution provided. Providence. I bet you really know, if you think about it, you're being looked after. That in itself, okay, it's not scientific, that's merely anecdotal, but you know you're being looked after. Lucid dreams, or real information does come from lucid dreams. I wouldn't be here had I not responded to information, primary information that I got through a lucid dream. Mediumship, probably not talk too much about mediumship because we're all familiar with it, and in this particular platform you all know about mediumship, and I've already mentioned some quantum physics. Going the wrong way again. So let's just blow the idea that materialism is a valid theory. Essentially, as I said, none of these things could happen if the process in the brain, if consciousness was produced by the brain. Telepathy would not be possible because thought processes would be a biochemical reaction in the brain, no form of transmitting them, no form of receiving them. But Dean Radin, who's a parapsychologist and researcher, states that there is several phenomena, and you can see them listed there, that exceed the 6 sigma level. That is 1 billion to 1 against chance. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but telepathy, look at the Ganzfeld tests. You get the ordinary Zener cards, but they had a certain amount of success, but because they're so boring for the researchers, success rates tailed off. But the Ganzfeld test is much more involved, involves several people to send images, and the overall result of that was something like 29 quintillion to 1 against chance. Essentially, they were getting a 32% success rate as opposed to a 25% success rate, but with the number of different experiments over the years, that amounted to fantastic probability. So one of the main skeptics was, he's often quoted as a skeptic in these things, called Carl Sagan, and he said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And this, you'll agree, is extraordinary evidence. Carl Sagan's other quote was actually to say that scientists have a duty, a responsibility not to ignore awkward data. And so he wasn't necessarily a skeptic, and he was also admitted that there are various things like telepathy and like children's past life memories that need a serious look at. So why isn't this recognized by mainstream science? Well, the scientific method is slightly problematic for this subject because essentially they can't make hypotheses on things they can't measure. So you can't measure a spirit, so they tend to ignore it. But essentially, it's ignorance of the data. This subject is taboo, and it's certainly taboo in scientific establishments. Pim van Lommel is a cardiologist who did lots of research on this, said that something like between 1924 and 1974, there was no change in the beliefs of the main American scientists, and essentially only 7% claimed that they had any spiritual thoughts. So basically, because they're mostly atheists, this wasn't in their nature to investigate. Plus, because they were in power, they controlled what other researchers did. And you'll see a quote in a moment, I hope. And this says it all, really. This is by Bethany Butzer, who is a researcher for Dean Radin. It says, if, as a scientist or layperson, you dare suggest that there might be other factors beyond matter, space, and time that are involved in our physical reality, for example, by studying topics such as consciousness, psychic phenomena, or mystical experiences, you run the risk of being metaphorically burned at the stake by having your research rejected, your reputation tarnished, and perhaps even losing your job. And this is the problem. This quote came about after some research that she'd been doing with Dean Radin with mediums, curiously. And in the research, they found that there was a different brain pattern recognizable when the mediums were being accurate. And essentially, John Maddox, who was the editor of Nature magazine, finally said he would do anything in his power to prevent public money being wasted on projects like this. So essentially, if you've got scientism, it's basically their belief, and that they don't want it challenged, that it's wrong. However, the good news is that things are changing substantially, even in the last few years. And I'm so encouraged by what I've seen recently that I think won't be long before this is mainstream science. Now, those graphs up there, that there's a database of scientific research called PubMed. Okay, so as you can see, the one at the top on the right, research with near-death experiences in the title. Okay, so you can see they started in 1985, and it's a good upward trend. Not a great deal, maybe 189, I think, is the total. Now, research with remote viewing, that's better. That's nearly 160, but it's the same exponential growth. Much more encouraging, research with spirituality in the title. So 2020, that's 2,000 research papers published with spirituality in the title. Last year, panpsychism was being openly discussed in Scientific American. So studying consciousness is now much less taboo. Even Dean Radin is very encouraging. And it's probably was started in 2016 by a paper being put forward by 100 or signed by 100 scientists calling for less restriction on what they researched. And secretly, many scientists were in favor of consciousness not being a product of the brain. So let's get back to some of the real evidence that hopefully many people will actually recognize themselves. Deathbed visions. So this is Steve Jobs, former head of Apple, and creator of the iPhone and things like that. So, oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. According to his sister, those were his last few words. Thomas Edison woke up out of a coma and said, "Oh, it's really lovely over there." Well, there have been two major studies. In fact, I think there have been more. This is slightly old data, showing that 50% of people experience them. Two major studies, different centuries actually, different researchers. Science likes patterns, so if you keep on finding the same things, it's more or less certain to be a real phenomenon. But they're moments of great joy. I was lucky enough to experience my mother having her deathbed visions. In her case, it started a couple of weeks before, where her eyesight appeared to be deteriorating. She thought, she was a GP, she wanted to know what was happening. She thought, she knew there weren't spiders running down to the side of the room, but that's what it looked like. Then the night before she died, and this is usual with deathbed visions, they usually happen 24 hours before somebody dies. She saw a friend of hers, a late friend of hers, a deceased friend of hers, and a symbol of Santa Claus. Well, she died on Christmas Day, so that was fairly indicative that it wasn't an hallucination. What interested me in particular was she asked me to trim her fingernails because, with her sense of humor, she didn't want to look untidy on the slab. Those were basically her words. And I picked up her hand to trim her nails, and she said, "Oh, isn't the power of touch amazing?" And to me, I've always known that there's something special in touch, but when somebody's awareness is expanding because the brain, the filter that is their brain, is beginning to break down, that to me is really strong evidence that there is something in the power of touch. Now, it's undoubted that these deathbed visions happen, because both these research projects show that 50% have them. So they happen, but are they real, or are they hallucinations? Well, there are patterns to them. Okay, so if they were hallucinations, then you get all sorts of weird things, but they're more or less always a deceased relative. Also, through these deathbed visions, people actually gain information, perhaps about the death of a sibling, or even about through somebody that they've met, through about financial things. So basically, they come out occasionally with verifiable facts. Now, the fact that they get those, the fact that their patterns are similar, is a strong indication that they are real. So deathbed coincidences, these are, the traditional grandfather clock stopping. And Peter Fenwick he was a skeptic to begin with, but he now is a firm believer in all this stuff. He's a good researcher into NDEs as well as this stuff. And he says people are suddenly aware of the death of someone they have a connection with. Clocks do stop. Animals behave strangely. People have sudden pains. There really is a disturbance in the force. Thousands of reports, and many are deeply touching. One example that he gives is of this Elizabeth Daniel, who woke up about 4 o'clock one morning, hearing her late husband's voice. She didn't know he'd deceased. She divorced him 28 years previously, and she heard his voice, "We don't need to talk anymore," or words to that effect. And it took a few days to find out that he had actually died on that night. And there are thousands of them. So Dewey Reeves, and he's not the only one that researched this, but he found that 50% of the 66 widowers that he interviewed had sensed the presence of their dead spouse in one way or another. Now, I want to tell you about my experience, because we're talking about the brain being a filter. Well, I was going to sleep one night. This is about 4 months after my wife had died, but I was not asleep. In fact, that particular night, I wasn't thinking about her. For the first time, I felt happy. I'd been to a party and things looked promising. Wasn't even thinking about it. But as I was going to sleep, just like that, like a flash, I had this brief communication. I knew instantly, without a shadow of a doubt, who it was. Total and utter recognition. I just knew. And in that flash, my response went, and I thought, I haven't got time to filter it, to edit it. Because normally you put things in the way that you want that sound best. Also, what she was communicating was concern, essentially. And she was right. So again, it wasn't an hallucination. But if I can't pass on to you how real that was. It was more real than real. You'd have to experience it yourself. But the point is that it showed the brain consciousness to consciousness communication. I've not had it since. I'm not a medium. I'm unlikely to get it again. But to me, that showed the brain was a filter. So I'm very grateful for having had that experience. Now, Bill and Judy Guggenheim studied after-death communication in 1988 with this after-death communication project, and they interviewed over 2,000 people, and their book is really worth looking at. Occasionally, I've thrown in a QR code, so if you're quick enough with your phone, you might be able to scan that for for the link that it takes them to. But they estimate that at least 60 million Americans, or 20% of the US population, have had one or more of these after-death communication experiences. Lucid dreams. Now, again, if consciousness was a product of the brain, you couldn't get useful information from them. But James Watson saw the structure of DNA in his dream. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was given the entire poem, the Kubla Khan, apparently. As soon as he woke up, he wrote it all down, but he couldn't remember the last verse. So it actually took him years to finish it off. Mendeleev saw the structure of the periodic table. So he was able to solve that one, and Niels Bohr, the structure of the atom. And there are plenty more. And there's the link, and there's a QR code. And as I said earlier, I had this lucid dream where I had primary information. So I've experienced that too. Now, mediumship. As you know, mediumship is wonderful. It's wonderful when you get an accurate message from a medium. And this particular link shows that brain changes in trance. In fact, some research shows that there is lower activity. It's as if they're getting their brains out of the way. But, oh, yes. And this recent article, finally, science is beginning to recognize that going to a medium when you're bereaved actually does make a difference. So mediumship is a fantastic gift. It also comes with a tremendous responsibility, because what we're talking about in scientific terms, they call it non-local consciousness. If you're looking at remote viewing, where does the information come from? And there can be no proof that the information comes from the other side. Now, in my time, I must have seen over 100 mediums, seen 250 sessions, if you like, at least. And I've seen some wonderful mediums. On 2 occasions, I've seen somebody receiving a hug. Only 2, but that was really touching, and it made such a world of difference. Other times, I'm convinced that I've seen people just reading somebody's mind. Now, if you have negative thoughts or a misguided idea, and that's fed back to you, that's not actually terribly helpful. So you've got to be very careful when you're receiving a message. Where is this coming from? And the only way to tell is whether it fits to your higher sense of right. Okay, so people do fall into the trap, particularly when you're bereaved. You want comfort, and comfort is there. Comfort can arrive, but it's good not to be too reliant on it. But some mediums are just brilliant. So mediumship is wonderful. So don't get me wrong, but be intelligent about how the messages are received, because you don't really know where the information is coming from. Past life memories. This story, there's a whole book about this one. James Leininger, when he was about 2, would have nightmares. He'd kick his legs in bed, and these nightmares would go on. His parents were really worried about him. Gradually, it came out that he said he was a pilot in the battle for Iwo Jima and was shot down. He was able to, he said that this guy called Jack Larson flew with him. He had 3 G.I. Joe dolls, and the names were people who received him when he passed over. He told them that he used to fly Corsairs. He told them that Corsairs used to get flat tires, and it turned out that if you land a Corsair, well, they'd land heavily, and they were always blowing tires. And he was even able to recognize a former officer by the sound of his voice. Now, it's all the details. I'm just skimming over the details there. Tiny one. I think when he was 4, he was given they're walking at a toy shop, and he picked up a toy, and his mother said, "Oh, it's got a big bomb on the bottom." He said, "That's not a bomb, Mummy, it's a drop tank." It really is the tiny details. They take on the persona. And this story, the detail just goes on and on, but I'll skip by that for the moment. Now, Helen Wambach wanted to disprove all this, so she did a 10-year study of past life recalls under hypnosis, but realizing that it's very difficult to research individual cases because possibly time consuming, she asked very specific questions that could be verified, things like clothing, utensils, money, the everyday stuff. And after I think it was 1,000 students that she regressed, her conclusion was that fantasy and genetic memory could not account for the patterns that emerged. Changed her mind. She doesn't believe in reincarnation. She knows it. Now, Ian Stevenson, he's the main man with, or was the main man. He's no longer with us. He spent 40 years of his life investigating past life memories. Jim Tucker has taken over from him. Now, he was a scientist using the empirical method, using, looking for data, and he would throw out any case where it could have been through fraud or the child might have found out through other means. You just throw them out, you stop investigating them. So out of 2,600 cases, 895 cases, he couldn't explain away by any other means. Just two examples are Swanlata Mishra and Ravi Shankar. Swanlata Mishra was a 10-year-old who was able to describe her house in where it was, what was behind it, in fine detail. She went along and she was able to recognize the family. One of her former personality's children pretended that he wasn't the child that she said he was, and argued and said, no, you are. And she was right. She also knew that her husband had purloined something like 1,400 rupees from a box. She commented on the changes that had been made to the house, and afterwards had no memory from the time that her former personality died. She knew nothing about it. Ravi Shankar, not the musician, he was a child who told his parents he wanted his old toys back. Then he described where his body was, how he'd been murdered. He was abducted by a washerman and a barber. I think the motivation was financial because there was some inheritance involved. But he described the toys. He was eventually shown, taken to his father, who happened to be wearing a watch. And he said that's the watch that he bought Munna, this former personality, in Bombay. And all this was accurate. The detail is phenomenal. He even knew that he'd eaten guavas on the morning of his death. Now, a lot of this information, you might argue, well, might have picked it up from somewhere, but 35% of Stevenson's verified cases had birthmarks relating to their method of death. So this isn't Ravi Shankar, but you can see there's a birthmark there that looks like a knife slit. On the other one, there's you've got two. You've got the photo of the birthmarks and the coroner's diagram sketch of the bullet wounds, and they're pretty close. Well, in 35% of these things, where you've got a gunshot, you'll have an entry and an exit wound, and to have the physical, there's evidence. There's no explanation. It can't be coincidence. Think about the possibility of chance. It just couldn't happen by chance. But my mouse has stopped working. Past life regression. Brian Weiss, he was a psychotherapist. This lady came to him who'd been through psychotherapy for years without any benefit whatsoever. So he used hypnotherapy to regress her. He was a skeptic. He, like the case I told you that I did, he wasn't expecting to regress her to a past life, just to the cause of the traumas. And she started describing several lives. And each time a traumatic experience would happen, usually connected with her death, this issue related to it would just lift. In between lives, Brian Weiss himself got messages from the spirit world to help him in his work. And look him up. He's an amazingly spiritual guy now. And he risked his career by publishing his results. He's got a book, Many Lives, Many Masters. And it's well worth reading. Prior to him, Arnold Bloxham, a hypnotherapist, got information that even surprised historians from regressing people. So we'll move on from there. If my keyboard will work, there we are. Now, near-death experiences. This is what I really want to talk about. We have a phenomena here that's been written about since 400 BC, instills profound and beneficial changes in all those who experience them. Not only experience them, the researchers have changed. Also, even if you read about them, you'll find beneficial changes. And they're the same across religions. Any preconception of what might happen has no change in the events. Blind people have them, and even the NDEs of children who couldn't possibly have read about them say the same thing. And this one quote by one lady: "It was simply the most amazing, beautiful thing I have ever experienced." Now, if you can show somebody that's bereaved that that's how their loved one will feel, then it doesn't take the pain away, but it helps, because they know their loved one not only is okay, is wonderfully okay. And you get a whole load of they're almost comical in a way, because people are cross with the physicians for having recovered them. There are hellish NDEs too. There's no particular explanation for these. I can't spend time on them tonight, really, but you can't assume that they're just people who've gone awry that have them. But even the people who have hellish NDEs are generally pleased that they had them, because they've given them a chance and they've realized that life is a gift. So it was Raymond Moody who first coined the phrase NDE. He produced his book in 1975, Life After Life, and he found 12 to 15 different things that happened to people in NDEs. Not all of them had all of them, but all of them had some of them. So this description, this inability to describe it, language wasn't sufficient to describe the nature of the, we are not capable of understanding some of these things. A feeling of peace without pain, awareness of being dead, obviously being out of body. Many go through a tunnel, not all. And meeting a deceased person, meeting a bright life, having a panoramic life review. Many reach a border which they know if they try and go beyond, if they succeed in going beyond, they can't come back. And then a conscious return to the body. Well, his research triggered a whole load of research. So Bruce Grayson, Kenneth Ring, just a whole load. And the curious thing is that they found the same things as Raymond Moody. Jeffrey Long went on to create this NDERF, that's the Near Death Experience Research Foundation. I've got a slide on that in a moment, but it's really well worth investigating that, because there are so many different accounts there. They're the real accounts that people have put in, and he has research analyzed the data, if you like, and it's the patterns of information. Something like 90% meet a deceased relative. If they were hallucinations, they'd all be different. Just imagine how weird your dreams are. Okay, dreams are still thought processing, but they're weird. Often they're certainly all different. My dreams are different to yours. So hallucinations are no doubt different too. If they were hallucinations, they would be different. Okay, and you can tell the tree by its fruit. They have beneficial effects, particularly with those who have the life review. Penny Sartori did a PhD in 8 years researching them. Pim van Lommel was the first to do a progressive study. I need to explain that a little bit, because Scientists don't like anecdotal information, so things that have been done in the past without any proper scientific study, because it's too late then to look at medical records. It's too late to do much. You have to just go on what they say, and how do you know what they said is true, other than Jeffrey Long's analysis saying, well, there are patterns. The fact that children have the same experience that blind people have, that other people have, and it's the same across cultures. The only difference is, talking about a being of light, it might be described as Christ, it might be described as Allah. It's only human interpretations of what they see that actually create any difference. But a progressive study happens where you analyze them as they're having them. So he had 384, I think, cardiac arrests. It was a project so that he could analyze the medical records as this was going on. And he was able to interview them before and afterwards. And this is why his was a longitudinal study, because he went back to them 2 years and 8 years afterwards. And he found that after 8 years, they remembered them almost word for word. So he was able to analyze their medical records and found there was no medical reason that why somebody should have an NDE. Sampani is the latest. He created this AWARE project. So they got several hospitals involved in different countries. They rigged pictures in the hope that somebody out of body would see a picture in a position that only somebody out of their body could see. But, well, I think I'm going with another slide about that. Well, if I have, I have. But yes, I know I have. So I'll leave that for a moment, come back to it a moment. So here's the NDERF website, and also the INDS website. That's the International Association for Near-Death Experiences. The NDERF website has got over 4,800 experiences, and that they're well worth looking at. So I was talking about Pim van Lommel's research. The point is, their memories had not faded at all. Now, if you look at the reason why they don't like anecdotal evidence is people forget. So memories are not reliable, but they are with near-death experiences. And I'm going to go into more detail later, but essentially, just imagine what happens when somebody has cardiac arrest. Within seconds, the blood stops to their brain. Their brain flatlines. Okay. Now you try picturing something that's behind you, or even on your wall with your eyes closed. These people are essentially dead. So how can memories even begin if consciousness is a product of the brain? The brain is out of the way. Even hallucinations require brain activity. These are fantastic experiences, these. So Sampania's research, 22% had a feeling of peace, 13% reported more senses more vivid than normal, 8 encountered a mystical being, 7% came to a border of no return, and 2% had visual awareness. So these are Raymond Moody's things. So he's showing the same things that Raymond Moody could. This is proper scientific research. There's only one person who was able to be interviewed after the visual awareness. The other one wasn't well enough, and unfortunately it happened to be in a room where there was no picture that could be positioned so that somebody out of their body could see. But this chap described exactly what had happened in the room. He described the cardiac, the defibrillator, and he described somebody who came in with his cap slightly funny on his head, and so medical records of what happened in the operating theatre exactly matched. So I've gone backwards on that one, haven't I? Where am I going? It's estimated that 4% of the population have had NDEs. Now, that's a staggering number. I think that equates to something like 13 million Americans. I don't know what it is in this country. My maths isn't that good, but we have a population of 60 million. So if any of you have got better maths than what I have, then there you are. Now, it's the detail. Now, this is Rachel's. So there's a case number if you want to look it up on the NDE website. I've got a permission to share this, but it's the detail I want to share with you. She basically died briefly while she was giving birth. There was a loss of blood, I think. I briefly hovered over my newborn baby, hoped she'd remember me. Then I was traveling. It felt like I was shooting through a tunnel, but I couldn't see any sides to it. It was dark but illuminated. I was not alone. I could sense a presence with me. I was tumbling forward, upward at an unfathomable speed. It felt like wind all throughout me, inside me. I likened it at that age to being on a roller coaster, that rushing feeling. It was wonderful. I felt so light, so free. Simultaneously, I experienced this fully and watched myself experience this with clear vision from a little distance. I can still see myself tumbling if I concentrate on the memory. As if I was staring at a giant screen that filled the whole of every which way I turned, the movie was my life from birth to death, every minute of it, every event I'd ever experienced. I watched it and relived it. It was at this point I realized that time did no longer appear to me as it had in my body. It was as if I were projected into a moment or dragged through time backwards before forwards to re-feel. I witnessed at this point the sexual abuse I'd experienced and suppressed as a young child, as well as out-of-body experiences I had at this time and at night when I was lying in my bed. I could see myself flying out of my body, and I remembered. I watched my own poor mistakes and learned from every reliving. I watched myself as a child bitten by a guinea pig and in shock half launch it onto the sofa. I felt shame at this time because I felt the fear of the guinea pig. No one condemned me. I was only asked what I had learned. I was comforted at this time, consoled and reassured. I'd learned so much, how big an impact my seemingly small actions had on a large scale, how my choices and behavior rippled through the lives of countless others, how the love I showed spread like wildfire, how the way I mistreated others deeply hurt and affected them, and also how that pain, fear, and confusion would then impact the lives of others too. In the time I spent reliving, I developed a deep gratitude for many things. The experience of life, for one, the people and the hearts that touched my soul in beautiful ways, and the fragility of being human. Now, you tell me that that was either constructed or an hallucination. And this is the point. Raymond Moody says the idea that these reports are constructed is just unthinkable. So the common things reported by NDEs: you are loved unconditionally. Time doesn't exist as we know it. We are beings of light and part of a single whole. Think of panpsychism, think of Max Planck. The purpose of life is to learn to love unconditionally and gain experiences. Sean Madden was asked, can you learn to love as unconditionally as you are loved? And Rupert Sheldrake, it's just postulated a theory. Was John the Baptist a drowner? Did he give people near-death experiences for their enlightenment? Just a thought. But the life review is the main thing, because they witness everything that they did from a moral point of view, how it made people feel. Kenneth Ring has a very good YouTube video, which is very powerful. He explains a friend of his had an NDE and he felt his own teeth crack as he punched somebody. And it's that powerful. So, and also people have life reviews, understand that life is a gift. People who have tried to take their own life, generally speaking, never do it again, never try again if they've had a life review. So they've shown the consequences of their thoughts and actions, and it's completely fast. Time doesn't exist, but it is this feeling of being loved unconditionally. Now, are they real? Okay, so well, you've seen my thoughts about them being hallucinations, but here are some veridical NDEs. So NDEs where there's been proof that what the person in the NDE saw was actually true. So Maria's shoe, that's a very famous case. She saw this tennis shoe with a worn out toe in particular on a window ledge outside the hospital. And Kimberly Clark Sharp, her care assistant, went to investigate, and there it was. And she said that even from the window, you couldn't see the detail that Maria reported. But she verified that the shoe was there and brought it in, and then they could see that the toe was worn. The next one is really quite amazing because Pim van Lommel's case, this chap was brought into hospital in a coma. Okay, so he couldn't have possibly seen anything to do with the hospital or anybody in it. He had his eyes closed and was in a coma. Then in his near-death experience, he saw a nurse remove his dentures and put them in a trolley that was beside the bed. And later on, he asked, where was his dentures? Where were his dentures? And they said, oh, she knows, as he saw the nurse. And that was impossible. Now, Pam Reynolds, this is the case that confounds all skeptics. She had an aneurysm in her brainstem, which required a groundbreaking operation. They had to chill her blood and then drain her brain of blood. So to make sure that her brain really was knocked out, they had a device in her ears emitting 100 decibel clicks, and gave her barbiturates and things to make sure that her brain was out. And then they drained the blood. Okay, so there she is in the operation, essentially dead because they stopped her heart. Then she was able to describe the bone cutter, bone saw, in detail, the sound it made. She said that a doctor said the veins aren't big enough, and the response was try the other leg. And they were curious about what the hell they were doing in her groin area when it was a brain operation. But of course they had to feed in intravenous tubes. She also said that it was a bit insensitive to play Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. Well, these are reports. And the point is, this was in an operating theatre where everything was documented. All this happened. Now, if you look at Wikipedia, which Wikipedia isn't a scientific thing, okay, but generally it's for disseminating information. And the scientific expert, if you like, is this guy called Gerald Worley, and he says it's constructed. And so therefore the general information is that you read from Wikipedia, oh, that case has been debunked, but no, it hasn't. I've read Gerald Worley's book, and it starts off very promising and looking as if he's looking for valid information, but essentially he says there are only 5 senses. Therefore, she could not have experienced it. Therefore, it was constructed. So it's his dogma, because as you've seen from telepathy, that's more or less proven. That's more scientific proof than most things. There are more than 5 senses. So anyway, Charbonnier reports a case where a patient of his witnessed an operation in a different room. There was an amputation, and the patient described this leg being put into a plastic or yellow plastic bag. Different room. How could she possibly know? It was accurate. Sampanier's research, as I've said, this chap described something that real had happened. And many NDEs themselves investigate to check to see whether what they experienced did happen, and they find that they have. Michael Sabom and Penny Sartori independently did research to see just generally if the people who had experienced NDEs could actually describe accurately what had happened. And they compared them to people who had cardiac arrests, been resuscitated, but reported no visual NDE. And surprise, surprise, the ones that had a visual NDE and saw what was going on got it right, and the others made mistakes. You know, I mean, that's a bit obvious, really. But the point is, for scientific research, that shows there is a significant difference, a statistical difference. That's scientific proof. So the lasting effects of NDEs: lose a fear of death, an increased belief in a creator, and less interest in organized religions. But people become more spiritual, more psychic, more compassionate. They do more things for charity, but they also live life fully. They realize that life is a gift. And curiously, many of them can't wear watches. Well, they can, but they just don't work. Mediums will probably realize tend to have an effect on electrical equipment. But people who come back with NDEs, some people come back from NDEs with an increased healing ability, or with a known healing ability, and that's a wonderful thing too. So, you know, these are genuine effects. They can't possibly be hallucinations. They wouldn't have any benefit. I'm conscious that time is running by, so I'll just quickly skim through some of these. Raja Benamor, she had an NDE, came back with a knowledge of quantum physics. She took it to her supervisor or university professor, who had to go and check some of the information she provided, and it took him a while to realize that she was right. Anita Morjani, that's one of the more documented ones, well worth looking up on YouTube. She had Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now, I understand precisely how difficult that is to get rid of. That's the disease that my wife died of. Yet Anita Morjani passed over. Her father said it's not her time yet. She came back, and within 2 weeks, there was no detectable sign of any cancer.
Wow.
Well, that is just staggering. My wife fought it for 4 years. It just doesn't go away, but it did with Anita Morjani, and all the medical records are there on the internet for you to look at. And she, the next morning, she said, "Oh, hi, Dr. Lee, how are you?" And he said, "How do you know my name?" "Well, you're the guy that did that procedure on me, draining my lungs last night." She also described a conversation that her husband had in a different room, something like 40 yards away down the corridor, about only being able to give palliative care, and there was nothing they could do. And the husband said, "Well, I was in a different room." Sean Madden, that's a friend of mine, because people don't talk about these things until you start talking about them. Then when you start asking people, they'll all come out of the woodwork. I know about 10 or 12 people now that have had NDEs, and his story is wonderful. He describes this being of light. He describes coming to a border first. It was a stream. And he said he didn't like his life at the time, and he really tried hard. He fought to get across this stream, and he knew that if he did get across the stream, he couldn't come back. Yet he couldn't get across it. And he met this being of light, and the love that he described from it was amazing. One that's not on this list is a guy called Tony Woody. And curiously, there was nothing wrong with him. It's quite funny if you look him up on YouTube, because he was an American aviator. He wasn't a pilot, but he was in this plane that tried to land. There was something wrong with it. They had to circle the airport for ages to burn off the fuel, because it couldn't. If it landed heavily, it would have destroyed the aircraft and probably them in it. But as it landed, the pilot got it wrong. It was a crosswind, and all of a sudden it veered off the runway. And Tony Woody says, "I never want to land on 2 runways in the same landing again." But basically, he jumped out of his skin, and he had this near-death experience. He saw this being of light, and the way he described it was: imagine the love from all the mothers that have ever lived coming to you all at once. Doesn't come close. Now, if you take that on board, this is why I'm putting on this talk. This is why I think people need to know it, because that amount of love, it's there. It's just there. We can't see it. We have this illusion every morning. We wake up, we see the physical, but that is there. Okay. Carl Jung is another one. He had a near-death experience and brought back some of the information that he got from that into his theories, into his treatments. There's a case there. I've got a QR code, and there's the link. about a group of firefighters. So again, this is an extraordinary case because it can't have been a hallucination because there were a group of them, and they all saw each other's near-death experiences. They were caught in a fire that the wind suddenly changed, and then they were in a dreadful situation. But fortunately, none of them died. But they all saw each other's other leaving their body, and they all said the same thing. I've also I know one person who's a medium who says that when his mother was dying, he went through the tunnel with her. Obviously, he had to come back, but it was a shared death experience. And there are these shared death experiences. And again, if you share an experience, it can't be an hallucination. So Penny Sartori, the crucial point I want to make, this is after her research into basically children's NDEs, is that NDEs undoubtedly occur and have very real life-changing effects on those who have them. Further to that, the wisdom gained during the NDE can be life-enhancing and have hugely positive effects on those who have not experienced an NDE. All we have to do is take notice and hear what these people have to say. Then she says, the biggest thing I have learned since undertaking my research is not about death, but about life. With our current technology and consumerist, materialist way of life, we have forgotten the most important thing, how to live. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did an awful lot of research on grief and is responsible for the, describing the 5 stages of grief. Her quote is, spiritual growth is a sole purpose for life on earth. Thomas Fleischmann says that he developed the same personality changes as those who had NDEs merely through his experience with those who had. And this is the point, the people who spend time researching, spend time with these people who have the NDEs, have changed themselves. So what do the skeptics say? Essentially, in one way or another, unless they're saying it's fraud or reconstruction, it boils down to hallucinations. So when you get a shortage of oxygen for whatever reason, some people have vision, some people have hallucinations. Temporal lobe epilepsy, you get people hallucinating. DMT, that's dimethyl, I can't remember what the thing is. it's an hallucinatory drug, but actually we have it in our pituitary. It may be the chemical that helps us go to sleep and helps us dream. But basically, all these things are essentially hallucinations. That's the skeptics' argument. But remember, the brain has flatlined. There's no blood flowing through it. The brain is not functioning normally. Basically, the people who come up with these things just ignore the data. They can't possibly explain the similarity. You can't explain the benefits. You can't explain the healing. They just ignore the data. Christine Stewart, she had an NDE. My belief is that if everyone had an NDE, there would never be another war. No one would starve or be the victim of violence, and greed would become a thing of the past. Daniel Brinkley is basically saying it's the small things that matter. It's the acts of kindness. I've told you about Sean Madden. Again, he said he was told there was only one being. It's the idea of panpsychism again, perhaps. Now, Einstein was amazing. There are loads of quotes I could throw at you from Einstein. But this is one of the best. A human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. But basically, he thought that science without religion was dead. It's also in our language. He jumped out of his skin. I've seen the light. And I don't know whether you know the word namaste.
Yeah.
Essentially, the meaning, the Hindu meaning of this is the divine in me bows to the divine in you. So that's the end of my talk. Namaste.